Hello, you're listening to Sending the Experts with Georgina Durrant. This podcast is all about teaching and supporting children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities, SEND. My name is Georgina Durrant. I'm the host of this podcast brought to you by Twinkle SEND. As a former teacher in Senko myself, I wanted to create a platform to share some of the amazing things that my guests are doing to support learners with SEND. So whether you're listening on your commute, tuning in whilst walking your dog, or curled up on the sofa with a nice cup of coffee, thank you so much for joining in. In this episode, I have the most amazing guest, and I can't actually believe I get to talk to her. It's Sue Cowley. Sue Cowley, I'm sure you all know who she is, but if you don't, she's a presenter, teacher, trainer, and author of more than 30 books on education. Wow, Sue. She's a qualified early years teacher. She's worked in early years settings, primary, secondary, and international schools in the UK and overseas. Sue's international bestseller, Getting Your Class to Behave, has been translated into 10 languages and is now in its 6th edition. Sue has written articles for Test, Teach Primary, Teach Early Years, Nursery World, Early Years Educator, and Teach Secondary. She has featured in numerous education videos and was a regular presenter on Teachers TV. And if you don't know what Teachers TV was, I do, and it was amazing. I remember watching it during my PGCE, and I actually remember seeing Sue on there. So it's pretty cool having the pleasure of interviewing her. She has also written curriculum materials for Oxford University Press. She works internationally as a presenter, providing keynotes and training for organisations including Teach First, the NEU, Swim England, and the Football Association. Sue has been part of the leadership team, helped at her local early years setting for the past 15 years. Wow, Sue, honestly, I'm so excited to speak to you.
It's lovely to talk to you, Georgina.
Oh, thank you. So yeah, your career, honestly, I feel like you're just one of those people in education that I've known since I started teaching. You've been one of these people, and I follow you on social media still, and yeah, you're amazing. Can you tell us a little bit more about your career? And there'll be people listening, younger teachers, who won't know what Teachers TV is, and there'll be people who are my age and older who will know what Teachers TV is. And it was brilliant. So can you tell us a little bit more about Teachers TV and your books and your teaching career and everything, Sue, please?
Yeah, I originally trained to be a teacher in the early 1990s. So I actually have a joke about this when I'm working with teachers now, and I ask who wasn't even born when I became a teacher, which is kind of depressing. But 30 years later, I'm still here. So I originally trained to do early years, but then I kind of moved around. So I've taught in primaries, I've taught in secondaries, and I was originally in London. So I taught English and drama in schools in London, secondaries. And then for a while, I went and taught overseas, which if people ever get the opportunity, I really highly recommend because it's
Yeah.
a very different kind of educational experience. And then when I came back to the UK, I went back into teaching in London, and I started thinking, I need to share some of the stuff that I've learned. So I'd written my first book, How to Survive in Your First Year in Teaching, while I was overseas. And my publishers, who are now Bloomsbury, but at the time was Continuum, they said, would you like to write a book on behaviour? And that's how we came up with the idea for what was originally Getting the Buggers to Behave, but we've now changed the title, which I think we'll talk about in a while. And I sat down in a back bedroom about a couple of miles away from where I am now, and it just spilled out of me. I wrote that book in 6 weeks.
Wow.
And it was like catharsis almost, because I'd gone through lots of different experiences, worked in really challenging environments. And my kind of key thing with my books was that at the time, back in the 90s, there weren't really lots of practical handbooks. It was mostly sort of theoretical guides when I trained. And so there was this kind of gap, and I wanted teachers to have really practical advice that they could actually use when they went in front of a class and the class were being difficult. So from writing that book, I then started to get asked to do training and presentations. So I started to combine the writing, which I've always wanted to do, even as a child, with still being at the chalk face. So I did supply teaching. I've done, like you, volunteering. I've run a magazine club for 10 years for a local primary.
Wow.
And then 15 years ago, I got asked to help out at the local preschool. So I got involved with that. And that kind of brought me full circle because I went back to my roots. And then during that time, we had Teachers TV, obviously, when Labour were in last. And that was a really interesting experience. It's actually quite hard to walk and talk at the same time.
It was
Um,
amazing though, because you went in. I was watching one episode, and I was. It was brilliant being able to watch back some of these episodes because you can find them on YouTube. I discovered, and it was a real, yeah, it really brought back a lot of memories from my PGCE. And I watched an episode of you the other day, and you were like, you had an earpiece, and there was a teacher, and she had to teach this
yeah.
class, this year 7 top set class, and you had an earpiece for her, and you were talking to her and giving her advice while she's teaching. And like, I remember observations of an NQT, and I thought, oh my goodness, can you imagine having Sue Cowley in your ear as well? And like, and cameras and being on teachers' TV while she's doing an observation. I thought that was incredibly brave of her.
Yeah, they were really brave, the teachers that got involved. They were brilliant, and it was really nice to try and kind of find a format where you could show. I mean, it was quite tricky in terms of permissions and stuff
Yeah.
with the children, obviously, but it was nice to find a format where you could show it actually happening, and it was real life situations. So we weren't, it wasn't kind of set up. The teacher was just teaching and we were observing and talking to her through the earpiece. So I thought that was a really interesting approach.
Yeah,
And that
no,
was great fun doing that. It was
I
something
bet it
completely
was.
different. But my background's drama, so it was a kind of natural thing for me to do that. So yeah, that was brilliant as well. And then these days I just kind of travel around. I'm still helping to run preschool. We're closed today because we're a polling station.
Oh, of course.
But I still travel. I'm lucky. I go around the world. This year I've been to China and Milan. Previously I've been to Chile and Brazil, and so it's wonderful. I travel around the UK as well. And what's really lovely, yesterday I spent a day working with new teachers, and they're always that same sense of hope and wanting to do the best for the children, but wanting advice on how do I cope when they're being tricky in terms of their behavior, and to be able to say to them, oh, you could try this or you could try this. And the other great thing is I always ask them for their ideas, and then I store up them and share them with the next set of
That's
teachers. So
brilliant.
you become like a repository for great ideas. Teachers are so creative. I think we forget this because of the way things are at the moment, but teachers are full of creative ideas, and
I
it's
love
great to
that you
share
sort of
those.
magpie ideas still and you're still learning from people. That's fabulous. I think that's really, really good. So your latest book, the one that's out, getting or not getting your class to behave. I remember it as
Yeah,
getting the buggers to
it's
behave.
great. Yeah.
Yeah, that's been in print for 23 years, which is an incredible achievement. Can you tell us like about it, and why do you think it's been so successful? I think I know why. I actually, and I'm going to tell you this, Sue, and I couldn't find this to bring with me because I wanted to bring this, but my dissertation from my PGCE, I quoted you in it. I had to write about the different behaviour management techniques from my PGCE years and years and years ago. I won't tell you how old I am, but yeah, and I remember having your book in there and actually thinking, am I allowed to write buggers in the in the references section, and questioning it, because you were right, there wasn't any other books then that were sort of accessible. It was all loads of textbooks, but I remember thinking, well, I'm finding this one useful and this one's giving me some advice about behavior, so surely I can use it. And I was allowed to include it and put it in there, obviously, because it's a book. But yeah, I remember that being a real conflict in my head, thinking, am I allowed to put this word down? So yeah, why do you think it's been successful?
And I think people say to me that what it is I just kind of laid out for them, this is kind of what you can do in a practical sense. And it's because it's realistic and honest. So often the conversations around behavior are this kind of, if you give them a consequence, everything will change. And it's like, but that isn't the reality of the levels of needs we're seeing at the moment, particularly. But I think for new teachers, particularly, they almost need somebody to just hold their hand and say, right, you need to have clarity of expectations, but that's really complicated. And you're going to have to do these things. And if this happens, maybe you could try this. I think people really like the little scripts I put in. And although they're a bit kind of cliched almost, I was trying to find a way to say, this is a way to do it that isn't probably going to work for you. Whereas if you try doing it like this, you're more likely to get things going well, but it's not a guarantee. And I
Yeah,
think people really responded to that realism and practicality and honesty. I think just being honest that, children are people and people misbehave. And even as adults, we do the wrong thing sometimes. So it's all about, I think, a sense of perspective. And the loveliest thing is when I meet people and they say, I read your book 15 years ago and it changed the way I teach. And that for me is the ultimate accolade that it actually had an impact on their classroom practice.
Yeah, I think it really did. I remember reading it and it was so supportive. Like, I remember that you were, yeah, as you do in teaching and in schools, you get some teachers that the children always behave for. And when you ask them for advice, it's like, oh no, they're behaving for me. And you're thinking, well, what am I doing wrong? Why are they not behaving for me? And I did find your book so supportive in the fact that it didn't pretend that children don't misbehave sometimes. It stated the fact that sometimes they do, and this is what you could do. And it sort of gives you an outline of what you can actually do and some things you can try. It's really, really supportive. Um, yeah, the change in the title then from getting the boogers to behave, I'm still struggling saying the title on here, to getting your class to behave.
Yeah.
Why the name change? And has any of the advice changed too, or was it just the name change? And I have read both books, so I do know the answer to this. But
Okay, so the name change, when I originally wrote it 23 years ago, my publisher, my editor at the time, Anthony, came to me and said, I've got this idea for a title, but it's quite controversial. Are you happy to go for it? And, 23 years ago, I was a young person and I was like, I think the climate was different.
yeah,
There was just this sense that it was something that would capture the imagination. And it was just framed as something that teachers might say, not in a classroom sense, but just when you go to the staff room, oh God, I've had this terrible lesson. How can I get them to behave?
yeah,
And at the time, obviously, it captured the imagination. I think it maybe gave that sense of the realism of the book.
yeah,
And then over the years, we've had various, not many, but we have had people complain and say, we don't think it's appropriate, you're not modeling. And my kind of attitudes and thoughts about behavior have not changed completely, but have grown
mhm,
through interacting with teachers, through working in different phases. And the kind of key reason we decided to change it actually at the moment is because the climate in this country is so toxic. I mean, I hate to talk about politics, and I think we just felt it was kind of time for a change. And as somebody I know quite well, Debbie Kidd, who's on Twitter, you probably follow
yeah,
her, she kind of flagged it up for me when I got into a conversation it was like a Twitter conversation where there are some people in the conversation who really hate you, and there are some people who really like you, which is fine. And these people were saying, well, do you think it's okay that this word is in there? And Deborah was saying, no, I don't think it's okay. I don't like that word. And I was tagged in and I said, that's absolutely fine. You are absolutely entitled to feel that way. And I started to think, well, maybe it is time for a change, time to reflect the fact that language changes.
yeah,
The things we said in the playground as children are completely, although sadly, you see, this is what I'm talking about toxic, they're coming back in.
yeah,
So you're seeing words, particularly around children with special needs,
mm,
online that you would not have seen in my
yeah,
lifetime as an adult. And that kind of triggered me to think, well, okay, maybe the time has come to update it and to
yeah.
just reflect a different society.
No, I like that. And I like that you've taken on board some feedback and you've changed it. I think that it really shows. Yeah. So your book is obviously all about behaviour, which is such a hot topic. Before we start properly, I'd love to know where you sit on on the behaviour approaches at the moment. Like, are you behaviour as communication? We've had guests on talking about like trauma informed approaches, or are you I don't think, are you more of a strict assertive discipline? Behaviourist, or even like zero tolerance approach? And we've spoken a little bit about it. You said you've sort of grown, your opinions have grown on behaviour, but has it changed? Have you moved one way or the other? Where do you sit?
Yeah, I would say if you read the original edition, the first edition from
Yeah.
2001, and you read this current edition, you would see my journey actually, which is really quite interesting, isn't it? So I think the original version at the time, assertive discipline had just come across from America with the Cantors. And it was pretty behaviorist at the time, if I'm honest. But actually, through interacting with teachers, working in different contexts, going into a totally different phase as well, I've kind of moved across. But what's really interesting is I do this thing when I work with teachers, and I start out with, I want you to think about your philosophy. Where do you actually sit? And I show them this diagram, which is like behaviorism at one side and restorative at the other, or relational at the other. And I said, because probably most people sit somewhere in the middle. I think often it's a product of phase. So
Mhm.
in secondary, I would have had 250 students a week. it's very difficult to do all the relational stuff.
Yeah.
In primary, you've got 30 children. In early years, you might have a ratio of 1 to 5 if you're working with 2-year-olds.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting is I've kind of moved across pretty much in the middle, but our setting, we don't have any extrinsic rewards. We don't use any sanctions. We're an early years setting.
Yeah.
And that's why I think it's really contextual. And this is why I think some of these arguments on social media, people are just coming from a different context.
Yes, I
So
often
it's a
think that.
kind of, it's like
Yeah, if you're teaching in a big secondary school with some challenging behaviour, and then compared to like an earlier setting, it's a completely different situation. And
yeah.
people on Twitter in particular, I won't
And
say
we
it.
see what we're seeing is stress.
Yeah,
And what's really interesting is their behaviour online is communicating how stressed they are,
yeah,
and the fact that they're under so much pressure that behaviourism starts to seem like a solution.
hmm
And sometimes I want to say to them, come to early years and just have a look at what's potentially possible. I don't think it's completely possible in secondary. I
yeah.
think practicalities make it very difficult, but things are possible. It's just that they're tricky. It's all about context, Georgina,
Yeah,
I think
no,
is
I
the answer.
completely agree. I think you're right. So I'm going to try and get as much advice out of you as possible during this episode, as I know our listeners will be just as excited as I am to hear from you and learn from you. So if we start right at the beginning, because there'll be new teachers listening, if they've got or exist, teachers who are experienced and have just got a new class coming, in terms of establishing behaviour, why
Yeah.
is that first lesson so important? Because it is so important, isn't it? But why?
I think a really useful way to think about this is how you feel when you're sat in an inset or a CPD session. And what we do subconsciously or consciously is we almost immediately start to form a perception of what the person who's going to be teaching us is like as a teacher, whether they're going to be able to control us, whether they are practical in their ideas, and so on. And in that first lesson, the children are basically meeting you as a person,
Yeah.
and so you have to give them this impression that even though you might feel really nervous as a new teacher, you're confident. Even if you're not feeling confident, you have to give them the impression that you're going to stay calm, relaxed, but you have clarity about what it is that you need. If they don't know what you need, they can't hope to try and achieve it. And what's really funny, Georgina, is about 15 years ago, I started setting an expectation of behaviour really naughty in CPD. I suddenly realised that I wasn't saying to them at the start, this is how I need you to behave. And so I go in there and I say, right, I'm going to give you all these things. And in return, while we are in this room together today, there is going to be one voice. I will be speaking some of the time, but sometimes one of you will be addressing the whole group. And when that's happening, we need to listen because that's how we learn. And then what that then allows me to do is show them all the techniques you use to get to that point. So if
Yeah.
one of them's addressing the whole group, it might be 200 people, and somebody quietly in the background, naughty teachers, is talking quietly, I will turn to the person who's actually trying to say something and I'll say, just pause for a moment and just wait until you can hear that there is absolute silence for your voice. And so I can demonstrate that you don't have to humiliate anybody. You don't have to spotlight poor behaviour. You
Yeah.
just have to say, this is how we're going to do it. And I'm going to reinforce it. I'm not going to give up on it. And
Yeah.
that's kind of central to really my philosophy of behaviour, that it's about clarity, certainty, and the children feeling safe. They need to feel that you can control the environment because they're children and there's 30 of them and there's only one of you. It's just realism, isn't it, really?
Oh, that's so funny as well, because we were talking about a Teachers TV one, the actual episode where I watched the other day as research. You were saying that exact same advice to that teacher in the earpiece. You said to her, just there were some boys at the back who were talking, but they weren't being really disruptive, and you said to her, just tell them to pause, and you just pause and say, I'm just waiting for silence until everyone. It was exactly the same words then. It was like watching you on Teachers TV. So so in
I
terms
never change.
it's wonderful. So that's what do they do in preparation for this then? Is there anything, because especially in the summer holidays, in the run up to it, or in any holiday running up to
Yeah.
this first lesson, is there anything they can do to prepare for this first lesson or find out things beforehand? Obviously, I'm going to want them to find out stuff about special educational needs and speak to the
Yeah.
Senko. But anything else?
So yeah, I would definitely say go and speak to the Senko, get your class list, particularly if you're in primary, you'll be able to get lots of information about the children, but try to avoid that making you come in with preconceptions. So it's about, acknowledge that there will be needs. If there are EHCPs, obviously you need to look at those. I think the other thing I always recommend to new teachers is don't go in cold. Don't turn up in that first lesson and have it be the very first time you practice introducing yourself to a class. Because what will happen is you'll go, hello, and you'll be really nervous. And that's not the time to make up that first introduction. So I say to them, practice your first lesson speech. Record yourself, get somebody to watch you, because that will give you a sense of what you're going to say. It's not a speech in the sense of writing it down, but it's almost like, how am I going to introduce myself in a way that feels natural, relaxed, has clarity to the children? Because your nerves, this is a lot of my work is around the fact that your emotional state, your situation, you can't allow that to influence the way that you work with the children. And often your instinctive approach will be the wrong thing to do. And I'll sort of say to teachers, when the kids aren't listening, what do you actually feel like doing? You have to acknowledge that you actually feel like maybe screaming, shut up, or running away or crying. And once you've acknowledged that you will have an emotional position, you can then become the teacher. So I say to them, this isn't my natural speaking voice. This is Miss Cowley talking to you here. And I'm presenting almost like, I suppose it's a drama thing, isn't it? It's almost like a character that the children are going to feel safe with, secure with, but also a sense of positivity and a sense of, learning is exciting. And I think we've kind of lost that a bit, that actually it should be joyful. I mean, I know for a lot of people at the moment, there's so much stress that it doesn't feel joyful all the time. But it should feel joyful, because otherwise, why would you do it? It's too
Absolutely.
hard
And
to.
spending, I remember thinking how lucky I was being able to spend time with, with teenagers and children all the time, and so much more fun than adults. And I think we forget that sometimes, that they are much more fun to spend the day with.
Yeah.
Much more
And you
enjoyable.
get 13 weeks holiday.
Well,
Never forget that one.
So setting expectations for behaviour is really, really important. But how do we maintain these, and how important is it to maintain them?
So I think there's two really key things that I talk about when I'm working with teachers. The first one is you have to actually reinforce it. You have to go back to them all the time. So for instance, in our setting, we have a golden rule of the week, and we spot the children doing it. We talk about why it's important. We model what it looks like when it's not happening. So it's that reinforcement, what they call these days retrieval practice, but it's essentially reinforcement. It's remembering what we've told them. And then I think the other thing around kind of getting them established is, don't undermine yourself. So if you have said, this is something I'll really hammer home, really, if you have said that there should be one voice or there should be silent attention, you cannot talk over them, because then you are telling them you didn't mean what you said, and you were lying to them. And I think that's the really tricky bit for new teachers particularly, is knowing what to do when it's not working, and not just go, okay, well, I'll just put the expectation to one side. And you almost, over the years, I'm sure you've found this, you come up with lots of different potential options for what to do when things aren't working as you'd hope. But you cannot undermine your own expectations by not modeling them.
That's such a good point. And I think as well, not sort of saying something that and not following it through, and being careful what you say is going to be the consequence. I know this as a parent myself. I once said to my own children, they're well behaved, I like to think, and they did something wrong, and I said, we're never going to go to the park again if you do that. And I thought, what am I doing to myself here? What am I going to do? Ban the park? And what, until they're like 20? What was I planning on? How was I going to follow that through? It was the most ridiculous one. We now laugh about it. They laugh about it. They're like, do you remember that time when you said we could never go to the park ever again?
But you're shooting yourself in the foot, because you want to take them to the park.
To the park. It's a really nice. I can get a coffee on the way. I can sit on a bench now. They're old enough to play. Like, it was ridiculous.
But this is back to the
run away
emotions,
with it, don't you?
This is back to the emotions thing, where it's really important to understand that teachers do that.
Yeah.
And all teachers do that. And I've done that. And that comes from a place of sort of lack of confidence.
Mm.
And once you understand that you may well do that, you learn to forgive yourself when you make those errors. So it's
Yeah.
not about not making errors, it's about identifying how those errors might undermine yourself.
Yeah.
So sometimes you will talk over them, and that's just inevitable, but you should have lots of strategies not to do that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So how can, because a lot of the stuff we talk about is making sure we're being neuro-affirming. So things like, we're not enforcing eye contact for children, particularly like autistic children who might find that uncomfortable, and not making children sit still if they find that particularly challenging, which can be difficult. I appreciate when we're talking about class behaviour and you're wanting consistent rules for a whole class. So how can we ensure like class behaviour is good, but we're also being neuro-affirming? We're not trying to change any children who are neurodivergent to make them more neurotypical. We're not trying to, make them mask and do all of that.
So I think this is about flexibility, really. And what's happened maybe in recent years is people have got a bit confused about the term consistency.
Mhm.
So consistency is not treating all children the same, because that's not realistic. Some children have higher levels of needs than others. Consistency is about clarity of expectations and finding different ways to get to those expectations. So for some children, that might mean, having a quiet word. For other children, it might mean ignoring a behaviour temporarily until you've got time to support them. For other children, so for instance, an example from our setting is there's a child who you can see that the sensory overload is getting too much. And there's a moment where if you intervene, if you preempt the problem and take them outside and allow them to just have that time to just, come back down, that stops the behaviours from escalating. So it's kind of flexibility, but also an intervention at the right moment. And I think the other thing is sort of preempting what's likely to go wrong and getting in front of it. So finding ways to creatively encourage them to do things that they might struggle to do,
Yeah.
and using imagination, using creativity. I get in a lot of trouble about this in my book. There's quite a few creative ideas in there, and some people really hate that. And children should just behave, and it's like, well, they don't just behave, do they? So what are you going to do about it? Just keep giving consequences. You have to think on your feet. You have to be flexible. So I
Yeah.
think that's the kind of key thing. I think the other thing with special needs, which I try to remind new teachers about, is that not all special needs have been identified,
Yes.
even by the time children leave school. So there's
Absolutely.
plenty of adults who are being diagnosed with ADHD or autism. And so it's very easy to assume one thing about behaviour when actually something else is going on that you're not really understanding properly.
Yeah.
So I think there's that as well.
Yeah, completely. I think that's a really, really good point. So in your book, you also explain about sort of waiting for silence. And we mentioned this already before speaking to the class. Can you explain this? And what happens? Because I think this is one thing when I was like starting out as a teacher, it's all right saying, wait until they're silent. But what happens if they aren't silent? Because sometimes that does happen. You are teaching, I've taught classes, and you wait for silent and they weren't silent.
Oh,
Do
yes.
you do
It
that?
happens a lot,
It
doesn't it?
does.
So I'll tell you a little funny story. When I wrote the original edition, I got an email from a teacher in Wiltshire, and he said, I read your book, I waited for silence, and I was still waiting 20 minutes later. And I thought, when I write the next edition, I need to be clearer about what I mean. So this is why clarity
Otherwise, you've got all these
matters.
teachers across the
Yeah,
country just stood there waiting.
yeah. In some instances, actually, it can be quite amusing too. So when I was teaching secondary, sometimes I would just get my knitting out and I would just go, if you're not ready to listen, I'm not ready to teach.
Or things that
But
can do, yeah.
what it is, so what I'm saying is, don't talk over a class that aren't listening, but
Mhm.
that doesn't mean you just have to wait. If you wait for around 20 to 30 seconds, you'll get a sense of whether the noise is coming down or it's just kind of going up. At that point, you then move on to a series of strategies that you can use. And this is where having lots of strategies really helps. So the first one I recommend these days to new teachers is do 5 examples of the children who are listening. That's brilliant. That table's listening. That's great. And maybe even, if you feel like it, move and sit with one table and start talking to them about how I really appreciate the fact that you're listening. You're clearly ready to learn. Must be a bit frustrating when the rest of the class aren't ready to learn like you are. And so demonstrate that the children who are doing the right thing are the ones who are going to get your energy and your focus. And again, that's very counterintuitive. It doesn't feel natural or normal to do that. But that then demonstrates that you're going to follow through with your expectation. Now, let's say that's not working. My next step might be to start writing messages on the board. Yeah. If you all refuse to settle for this lesson, then I'm going to show you the task on the board, and I'm just going to ask you to get on with it, and I'll come around and help you individually. So that's kind of, I'm not going to whole class teach you. Another thing you might try is thinking, well, should I actually start the lesson with the whole class teaching input? Or do they need something to explore? And I said this to some teachers the other day, and one of them got in touch the next day and he said, I went into my class and instead of talking to them at the start, I got them straight onto task and they were completely different. And then they were able to settle, because often they've just come from somewhere in secondary, or they've just come from break in primary, and their minds are full of, oh, so hit me. Yeah. And they need almost like an opportunity to get that out. So, in some instances, it's about changing your pedagogy. In some instances, it's about changing curriculum. In some instances, it's about targeted praise. And if you get to the point then that everybody still isn't listening, what you mustn't do is whole class punishments. And I tell you why. My kid, who's a teenager now, finished at school, sleep next door, obviously, a teenager, came home from secondary school one day after a lesson, I won't name the subject, and said, I will never forgive that teacher. And I was like, oh, what happened? We all got punished when not all of us were talking. And that sense of injustice, particularly for neurodiverse children, is, that's it. That relationship was like broken.
Yeah.
And I thought, I can understand why the teacher did that. So as a new teacher, I did that kind of thing. Minutes on the board, blah, blah, blah. But it just doesn't work to build relationships with the children who want to.
Well,
They want
exactly.
to
You're losing the
help
only
you out.
ones that wanted to behave in the first place, aren't you?
Yeah,
The ones who were on your side at the start, you've lost them, so they're all off your side, aren't they?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But I understand where the instinct comes
Yeah.
from. And
Yeah.
I'm not saying I've never done it,
Yeah.
but best practice is to try not to undermine your own expectations by not following them.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I like the bit you said about sometimes not being teacher led right at the start if they're not in the mood. Because I had a really lovely, but bubbly year 10 class once. And I think it was on a Friday afternoon. So you can imagine they'd come, I think they had PE before. I was really set up, Sue, with this class. They'd arrive really, really bubbly, lovely, but bubbly. And loud. And I remember someone saying, oh, why don't you try doing like a rotation activity when they come in and they move from one desk to another and they go straight into a task, as opposed to just trying to get them quiet. And it was wonderful and it worked. And that was just the way we did our Friday afternoon lesson they had after PE, and it worked and they got loads of work done. But it was just about that flexibility and working out what was behind that behaviour, why they were coming in such a different mood, why they were so bubbly and loud. And
I wonder if this is one of the reasons why. So we're seeing a lot of disaffection at the moment in the system, and we're also seeing quite a lot of schools that are saying you have to use this format for your lesson. You have to have this particular PowerPoint format. You have to start with this, and you have to react to the children who are actually in front of you. And if you can't be flexible around that, then you are going to end up, that's a C1, that's a C2, you're going out. Why get into conflict if we can be creative and think laterally about potentially different options? It doesn't make sense to me.
No,
but
it doesn't. Yeah, the flexibility of being sort of more human and understanding, I suppose.
Exactly. They're just people. They're just smaller people.
Sometimes taller as well, so I often found out the time they were actually taller than me.
Yeah, yeah.
I often notice in the book you explain the importance of using statements instead of questions, and how using rhetorical questions is sometimes a mistake when speaking to learners. And I know this can be particularly true for some neurodivergent children who, and I wrote about it in my own book, rhetorical questions can be very confusing for some children. Can you explain this a little bit more?
Yes. So if you ask a question, children assume you're asking a question. And what rhetorical questions tend to result out of is frustration. So a kid is doing something you don't want them to do, and you go, "What's out of your seat?" And what do you expect them to say? You're not actually, you're framing it as a question, but you're not actually asking a question. And I do a little demonstration with teachers, which always is my funniest moment, because I say to them, I do this whole thing about encouraging them to volunteer, which is like we have a raffle and so on. So I know I'm going to get a volunteer. And I say, is there anybody who's willing to volunteer to swear at me? And there's always one. There was one yesterday, and
Really?
he loved it. He was like, yeah, I'll swear. So I say to them, right, I go over to the person. I say, right, I'd like you to imagine I'm the teacher, and you're going to say to me, am I allowed to swear in this
Yeah,
podcast, or would
sure.
you
I'll
like
give
to?
you
So
permission.
I
Go.
say to them, I'd like you to say to me, fuck off, miss, in the best tradition of secondary students that I've met. And I'm going to react with a rhetorical question and like you to say what a learner would say. So they always do it like really meekly at the first. They go, fuck off, miss. And I go, no, do it like a kid. And they go, fuck off, miss. And I go, did you say? And they go, said, fuck off, miss. And that's like the perfect example of why you shouldn't do it. Don't allow your emotional frustration to result, because I'm sure you've found this, Georgina, that so much of working, particularly with children with special needs, is around framing. How I frame what I say
Mhm.
will impact on how they react to it. So it's like that thing where you just say to a child, would you rather start by doing this, or would you prefer to start by doing that? Just that sense that they have a little bit of agency, a little bit of choice, they're in control, can just completely stop them. And teachers will use words like they're defiant, they're
Yeah.
refusing, and they're almost being backed into a position where the natural response, so what we're looking at is what is the natural response, how can we encourage that natural response to be more useful to us as teachers.
Yeah, and I think
uh,
with the rhetorical questions, if you do think literally, and
yeah,
somebody asks you a rhetorical question, and like, why are you doing that? And then you just think, oh gosh, they're asking me why I did it. I better explain.
yeah,
It must be really hard. Then this child gets told off again, and they must be thinking, well, why did I get told off?
yeah,
They asked me a question, and I answered a question. That's what I'm supposed to do. These sort of unwritten rules around rhetorical
yeah.
questions that might get sort of missed by some children can get them into more trouble and get them quite confused on why they're in trouble, and it
And
sort of ruins
it's
that
the same
relationship.
with, yeah, it's the same with sort of idiomatic language. We use it without thinking,
Yeah.
but for some children it's just not useful, it's not helpful, they don't understand those social mores. So
No,
we
exactly.
just have to have clarity is probably the
Yeah,
key, isn't it?
yeah, definitely. So we've spoken about children who aren't behaving appropriately, but what about the children, and like your child, you mentioned your teenager, who are behaving in every single lesson? Can they sometimes get missed, and how can we avoid this? Because I remember this being a huge conflicting thing because you're focusing so much energy on trying to make the class behave that the ones that are behaving, you feel like you're letting them down sometimes.
Yeah, again, this is something I talk about a lot with teachers, and I call them the Nike children, the kids who just do it, and they do get overlooked, don't they? But what's really interesting is sometimes those are the children who actually are quite good at getting away with low-level naughtiness. So
Yes.
there's this kind of double-edged thing going on here, which we probably don't have time to explore, but I've got quite a few funny stories about that. But anyway, yeah, I think you just have to remind yourself, first of all, that you should try, if you are using extrinsic rewards, you can try, there's lots of strategies, like if you're going to send postcards home, just get all the children to address a postcard at the start of the year and keep them in your drawer. And then you know that everybody's getting something. I have found as a parent that my own kids haven't particularly had lots of extrinsic stuff. And I think that's because their teachers know they don't need it.
Yeah.
And the research kind of shows that actually often extrinsic will undermine intrinsic. And personally, I think something that's useful to do actually is to have generic conversations with a class about needs, and about how some children need more reassurance, more um, external input. And that picture where there's a wire fence,
Yeah.
it's like the equity and equality one. And it's almost like, I'm just putting the scaffolds in place for those children who might need them more than others. So I think we can be quite open with children about this. And
Yeah.
I actually think that children are, generally speaking, more accepting than adults. So I think there's this kind of balance between making sure you include everybody if you're going to use extrinsic rewards, but letting the young people know that some people need more support than others. That's a
Yeah.
life lesson, isn't it, really?
I think that's
Um,
really, really important because, yeah, you do think sometimes, you know, if there's these rewards where they're getting them for behaving or whatever they're getting them for, and then if the children see the children who don't behave all the time and then do behave get this reward, it can feel a little bit unfair sometimes to the children who think, well, I behave every lesson, why? But then if they understand the reasoning behind and they're being told, you know, sometimes we do need a bit more support and some, you know, this is going to help them, then yeah, I think that can be quite a nice
and I
test.
think with extrinsic rewards, I do worry a bit that we get over reliant on them.
Yeah.
So it's like, you know, give them a dojo. I mean, I find I understand the instinct, but when I look at our set, we haven't had extrinsic rewards for a decade.
Wow.
Nobody notices.
Yeah.
We've almost become over reliant because perhaps because the pressures of behaviour are quite high at the moment. But it's a kind of, it almost becomes like you get a bit addicted to them.
Yeah.
And I talk to teachers about often the best motivators aren't the merits, the stickers, they're creative things. So I have all these stories about that teachers have told me about really amusing, ironic, subversive, creative things that they do, or individualized rewards that just, they're not even rewards in a sense, they're just indicative of the relationship that the
Yeah.
teacher has with their children. And I think those are so much more powerful. And I think we often reach for systems when we feel disempowered.
Yeah.
So I wonder if that's just saying something about the needs within the system at the
I
moment.
think that's a good point. I think for some children, just, you know, just going up to them and saying, "Oh, well done," and just, and it means more to them than anything else. Or, you know, if they, or if you've got a good relationship with the parent and just having a chat with them after this, yeah, it's different for each child, isn't it?
It is,
And I
yeah,
think it's
yeah.
all down to relationships and getting to know the kids and knowing what works for
I
them.
mean, probably the best reward that the sleeping teenager had in the whole time at school was when one of the teachers brought a book in from home and said, I think you'll really enjoy this book.
Oh,
And it had arisen out of something that had happened in a lesson where there was like a bit of a challenge over some terminology. And the teacher just thought, you know, and that's a reward in a sense, but
that's
it's
good.
not a kind of sticker or a
No, but it means
certificate.
more, doesn't
It's
it?
something really special because it arises out of the relationship.
Yeah, and you know they've been thinking about them, and yeah,
Exactly.
it
I
means
saw
more.
this and I thought of you.
Oh, I love that. So there's been a lot of talk recently about whether or not children should miss out on things like school trips, school proms, if they haven't been behaving well. Anyone who goes on social media, particularly Twitter at the moment, probably will have seen these debates. So I'm going to drag you into it. So what's your opinion on this?
Okay, I've always felt that we shouldn't combine the two.
Hmm.
So we should not use a removed reward as a sanction,
Yeah,
and that the decision making should be separate. Now, the example from social media seemed to be about attendance.
yeah,
And for children with medical issues, it just is, I think, I mean, I don't think unethical is too strong a word. It's not ethical
no,
to say you can't come on this treat because you haven't attended. Now, again, I understand that schools are under massive pressures around attendance, but we have to be so careful. It's the same with Ofsted. You have to be so careful not to allow those pressures to make you act in a way that, you know, is counter to the children's best interests.
yeah,
And then it got into a discussion, didn't it, about how these children aren't safe. Yeah. Now that's a separate thing. If you
completely
risk
different.
assess and a child isn't safe, then my first thought would be maybe I need to change this kind of end of year thing that I'm doing.
Hmm.
Maybe I need to find a different way to, I mean, proms are a whole other thing, aren't they? And I'm not a huge fan of all this American stuff, but I totally get the instinct that if they're not going to be safe, then I understand that. But what tends to happen, what can often happen, is that children get pulled out of stuff that's actually educational stuff. So when I was teaching drama in a school in London, we were doing a school production of Bugsy Malone, and one of my starring characters, my fat Sam, got in trouble on a school trip, and there was the threat that he wasn't going to be able to appear in the school production. And I
Oh,
was like, it's like where you take kids out of sports teams.
yes,
It's
yeah,
why are you mixing up um, learning with I think it's such a complex area, and I totally understand the thing about risk assessment, but I think it's become about a separate thing when you're talking about attendance.
Yeah.
Our children are actually out on a trip, but because they're early years, the parents have to come. And I was thinking maybe that would be a solution for secondary. You can come, but a carer has to come with you.
That would go
I
down
don't know.
very well,
But
wouldn't
I'd
it?
imagine children with special needs often get caught up in those kind of things.
Yeah.
So it can become quite inequitable. So I think probably the solution is to think about the rewards we're using
Yeah.
rather than to confuse them with a sanction.
Yeah. No, I think I handled that very well, Sue. Thank you. Right, before we finish, are there any links? Because what we'll put is, so if you're listening to the podcast on your phone, if you scroll down, you'll be able to see the links that I'm going to mention now below. And if you're watching us on YouTube, they're down here. What links are we putting there? So
Well, I built my website myself, and
nice.
I'm what you might call a silver surfer. I was pre-internet. I remember dial-up. But what I do when I meet teachers, I put all their ideas on my website.
Oh,
And
brilliant.
so it's very basic, is what I'm saying. But there's lots of good ideas on there. So that's suecowley.co.uk.
Brilliant.
In terms of other links, oh gosh.
Can we do a link? We'll do a link to a book as well.
Oh yes, so you will be able to find Getting Your Class to Behave on Amazon. And if you'd like to leave me a review, Georgina's been very good at this recently. If you'd like to leave me a review, that'd be great, because they haven't connected up with the old editions yet.
Oh,
So I've lost all my old reviews.
oh no.
Yeah, they'll get it done
A
eventually.
campaign on here right now to solve this for Sue.
And then I've just finished a book which is now in production, which is called The Ultimate Guide to Self-Regulation in the Classroom, which I think is going to be a real game changer for people who are struggling around behaviour, because it's all about behaviour, but from a totally different perspective, from the perspective of how do you actually teach behaviour? How do you support children to self-regulate? So I think that would be really useful.
Brilliant. Yeah, I'm sure our listeners would be really interested in that one, Sue. Thank you. I will put a link to that as well.
And then I've got a YouTube channel, but I don't put much on there, so don't worry about that one. I'm not as technologically advanced as you young people.
Oh, thank you so much, Sue. It's been such a pleasure to speak to you.
It's great to speak to you, Georgina.
Bye.
Wow, I feel super lucky to have been able to speak to Sue Cowley. Wasn't she brilliant? Some great advice. And I would really recommend, if you have any ECTs, to make sure you show them this podcast and give them the link, because I think they'll find it really useful. Thanks again for listening to Sending the Experts with me, Georgina Durrant.